The Russians are deploying a significant number of Tu-95MS strategic bombers to the Olenya airfield to confuse Ukrainian intelligence, particularly in matters of planning routes for Ukrainian UAVs. This opinion was expressed on air by Lieutenant General, former Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Igor Romanenko. They are protecting themselves in this way, while we are gathering ourselves, while we are conducting reconnaissance, planning routes, and they will rise and redeploy. And we see that they are trying to do this all the time. And this is good because they are spending resources, preserving instead of striking. Romanenko explained. The Lieutenant General called this an important achievement of the Ukrainian Defense Forces and compared it to the start of operations in the Black Sea, which were aimed at displacing the Russian fleet. Look at the results this led to. We drove them into other ports, destroyed a third of their ships and vessels, and now we are chasing their strategic aviation in this way. Romanenko added. So, Ukraine may destroy Russian Tu-95MS strategic bombers at the Olenya airfield. Earlier, Defense Express reported, citing satellite images, that Russia had pulled up to 20% of its total Tu-95MS strategic bombers to the Olenya airfield. At the same time, at the Engels airfield, from where enemy aircraft take off during massive strikes on Ukraine. As of May the 25th, there were 6 Tu-95MS bombers, 3 Tu-160s and 4 Su-34 fighters. It is noteworthy that the next day there were 3 Tu-95MSs, the same number of Tu-960s and 2 Su-34s. After the Russian occupiers launched a massive missile strike on Ukrainian territory on May the 26th, 7 Tu-95MS aircraft landed simultaneously at the Engels airfield. Another enemy bomber headed for Olenya. From these specific maneuvers, one can assume that the Russians are constantly ferrying their bombers between different airfields intentionally in order to confuse the intelligence structures of the defense forces of Ukraine and partner countries. In particular, to complicate the recording of the moment of a combat flight to carry out a new missile strike on Ukraine. At the same time, it turns out that the Russians are going for such maneuvers even at the cost of overspending the limited resource of flight hours for the Tu-95MS, Tu-22M3 and Tu-160 at the same time. The authors of the material state, the occupiers also transferred 12 aircraft there, which could belong to both the enemy's transport aviation and to the naval aviation. At the same time, experts note that during the last massive strike on May the 26th, Russia used only 3 of the 11 strategic bombers that were at this airfield against Ukraine. The liberation of the occupied territories of Ukraine must begin with Crimea. This was stated in an interview with Fabrika Novosti by military expert, pilot instructor and retired colonel of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Roman Svitan. Of course, we need to start liberating the occupied territory from Crimea, which is itself an operational cauldron squeezed between two seas with one entrance and exit. That is a bridge. I don't consider the northern exit. It is under our control with weapons. The Kerch Bridge is 300 kilometers away. The destruction of the Kerch Bridge transfers the entire military garrison of Crimea to a military operational cauldron. They can't go anywhere, the expert emphasized. He recalled that the defense forces have modern unmanned boats at their disposal, which the Russians are afraid of. According to the expert, they can be used together with drones and other weapons. The expert is confident that if hundreds of UAVs were regularly launched at the relevant facilities in Crimea, most Russian citizens, the so-called illegal tourists, would leave the occupied peninsula. "They'll return beyond the Urals," said the colonel. Svitan is confident that about 200 military facilities that the Russian Federation has located in Crimea can be destroyed with the help of drones within a few months. At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces have a number of missiles that can also reach the autonomous Republic of Crimea. At the same time, the military analyst emphasized that a military operation cannot be launched without a full aviation component. Of course, the worst thing for Putin is if we start liberating our territory from Crimea. He understands perfectly well that after losing Crimea, he will definitely lose his seat and even his life. Russia will simply start to fall apart. The most interesting thing is that liberating Crimea will require an order of magnitude less forces and resources than liberating Donbass. 10 times less than liberating Donbass, Svitan emphasized. In his opinion, with the loss of Crimea, there will be no point for Moscow to hold the land corridor in Donbass, since it is used by the occupiers only to ensure the security of their group in the autonomous Republic of Crimea. Earlier, former US Army commander in Europe, General Ben Hodges, said that Ukraine should not give in to pressure and give up part of its territory, especially Crimea, which is a strategically important territory. According to the general, Ukraine could return Crimea, and this would provoke a turning point within the Russian Federation itself. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin himself will not agree to diplomatic agreements if they envisage Russia's renunciation of Crimea.
The later Ukraine gets the opportunity to use long-range weapons of its allies against the Russian Federation, the worse the situation on the front will be. This was stated by a veteran of the Russian-Ukrainian War, Reserve Major of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, military analyst Alexei Getman on air at Kiev 24. According to him, if you don't hit the enemy, his aggression will only grow. The Russians, when they understand that they are not getting anything in return, they are not afraid. They continue to pull everything they can to the front line and attack more. And these permissions that are gradually coming in are a gradual understanding of what is happening when we cannot give retaliatory strikes, Getman noted. He is convinced that if this understanding had come in the first year of the war, and Ukraine had then received air defense systems, and permission to fire missiles at Russian military targets, and modern aircraft that could carry these weapons, then the front line would now be completely different, especially in the south. According to the military man, in particular, the Kerch Bridge could have been immediately destroyed, which would have significantly reduced the Russians' ability to provide for their southern group. The later the permissions for the use of weapons in the Russian Federation are issued, the more the Russians will be able to advance and the worse the situation on the front will be, Getman emphasized. As reported, the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated yesterday that Berlin will support Ukraine in developing long-range weapons. Before this, he announced that Western partners had lifted restrictions on the range of weapons supplied to Kyiv for Ukraine. According to him, there are no longer any restrictions on weapons from Germany, Great Britain, France, and the United States, so Ukraine can defend itself by attacking military positions deep into Russia. In Russia, these statements have caused hysteria, as evidenced by the reactions of the country's leadership and the so-called mouthpieces of power. In particular, the press secretary of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, stated that the German chancellor's statements about long-range weapons are nothing other than further provocation of war.